This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and in the early hours of Thursday, the 7th of April, these are our main stories. The BBC has been told that Russian forces used civilians as human shields to protect themselves from a Ukrainian counter-offensive. Britain and the United States have imposed new sanctions against major Russian banks and more members of the country's elite. Plus, the death has been announced of ultra-nationalist Russian political leader and Putin ally Vladimir Jaranovsky. Also in this podcast, Pinterest bans misinformation about climate change and...
If you want to have robots that can do jobs from, say, clearing up rubbish, sorting out our recycling, then they need to be able to have a physical dexterity that we have as humans.
Why scientists are developing robotic hands with the human touch. The BBC has found evidence of Russian troops using citizens as human shields in villages north of the capital, Kiev. People living in the area have described how they were rounded up at gunpoint and forced to gather in a local school to protect Moscow's forces against Ukrainian counterattacks. Our correspondent, Jeremy Bowen, has visited villages to the northwest of Kiev, where he also heard accounts of troops shooting civilians and holding others captive.
In Obukovici, we spoke to many people about what happened on the 14th of March. They told the same stories about 24 hours that traumatized the village. The Ukrainians were on the attack. The Russians had been losing men and armored vehicles. Civilians sheltering in their cellars could hear explosions and the grinding sound of tanks maneuvering. Around 8 or 9 in the evening, Russian soldiers went door to door, ordering people out at gunpoint. If they didn't open up, the Russians broke the doors down. Around 150 civilians, including the elderly and small children, were marched to the local school. What happened? What did the Russians do? Ivan, a man in his 60s, said they were making us into human shields so the Ukrainians couldn't shell us. The Russians are fascists, he said, vandals. It was chaos, children and people crying. One of the women held in the school, Ludmila Sutkova, told us what happened that night.
They took us from the cellars where we were hiding and forced us out using machine guns. Old ladies, children, everyone. It was terrifying. Anyone who didn't open their door was forced to. It was so scary when explosions came. We thought, if the ceiling falls, this will become a mass grave.
They were held in the school's gymnasium, which they said was freezing cold. Some of the Russians were drunk and threatened to take them to Belarus. In every part of the area, which has been largely cut off by mined roads and blown-up bridges, civilians speak of other abuses by Russian soldiers. A priest was shot dead. Men were held in the open, often bound and blindfolded for weeks, subjected to fake executions. The evidence that Russian forces repeatedly broke the laws of war to which their country is a signatory is accumulating.
Horrific reports are also emerging from other towns and villages near Kiev previously occupied by the Russians. Tim Judah, a journalist for The Economist, has spent the last 4 days touring some of them. He's now back in the Ukrainian capital, and he told Evan Davis what he'd seen.
Today I was in Borodyanka, which has really been severely damaged. I mean, they used planes on Borodyanka. So there, unlike some of the other places, like Bucha, like Irpin, you've got whole blocks of flats which have come down. And there are firemen and rescue workers moving the rubble, trying to find people who would have been trapped underneath in the basements. And then you'd have that whole block coming down on them. But this happened weeks ago, so presumably, and unfortunately, they won't find any survivors. And then on Sunday, I was in a village called Motozhin, and Motozhin is where the Russians detained the mayor on March 23rd, her adult son and husband. We saw them in a sort of shallow grave in a pine forest next to a big house where the Russians had been staying. And also quite close to them was a man called Mr. Merchinsky, who had been murdered and dropped down a drain. And his wife, who was there on Sunday seeing him for the first time, said she thought that the reason that he had been presumably executed by the Russians was because they had found pictures of destroyed Russian tanks on his phone. This is, we're discovering, is something the Russians are very paranoid about, people taking pictures and using them to report back positions to the Ukrainian security forces.
How much more is there of Russian-occupied territory where, step by step, journalists, officials and others are going in and are likely to be finding this kind of thing?
There's still quite a lot, but what I think is going to happen is that we're going to find other things which we haven't really kind of understood until now. I mean, it's kind of obvious that the first thing that you see is journalists going into places like Bucha with kind of dead bodies on the street and people tied up and clearly executed who've been in basements. But today I met in Borodyanka a man who told me that he lived in a village near Borodyanka, that he'd been detained after the Russians arrived. He said that he'd been sort of held a prisoner for 15 days, and he said that of 11 people that he'd been imprisoned with, 7 he knew of were fine, the others he didn't know about. And he said that from his village, 18 to 20 people were missing, and I'm saying missing in inverted commas. I can't verify his report, it was just one man, but I have a terrible sinking feeling that that's what we're going to find out, that there's a lot of men who were detained, imprisoned, beaten up, interrogated, and a lot of them didn't come home.
Is there a kind of organised effort to document and make sure that every bit of this is being recorded for later legal accountability?
I think there is. I mean, I saw very early on, weeks ago, at a block of flats which had been hit by a missile here in Kiev, there were people who'd come to document it for the International Criminal Court. They were Ukrainians, but they were gathering evidence for the International Criminal Court for some sort of possible future proceeding. And I think that, all sorts of proper judicial procedures, etc., have been followed when bodies have been found. They're not just picking them up. They are doing what they would do if there had been a murder.
And what about Ukrainians who had fled those areas? Are they returning? The heart breaks to think of what they will find when they do, but are people going back and poring over the rubble and the destruction and the violence?
There are some people returning, but they're not returning to live, especially if their house still exists. Most houses are still there. And assuming that they're not somewhere else in the country and assuming that they haven't gone abroad, yes, people are coming back, but they're coming back to get their possessions and to clean up and to put plastic in their broken windows and to secure their properties. But they're not staying for the moment because, first of all, there are all sorts of booby traps left lying about. There's unexploded ordnance and missiles on the ground. And the main thing is that, in general, water and power haven't been restored in these places, so you can't live in them yet. Today in Borodyanka, I was literally just walking down the street and there was a man in uniform, I think he was actually a policeman, coming out of a house carrying a big tin, and I asked him, what's that? And then they showed me, because there were several other police there. Incredibly, it was a booby trap bomb. The fuse had been taken out. They showed me the fuse, which had been left in the washing machine of the house.
Wow.
And luckily, it had been taken out and defused. And there was a woman who owned the house who had just come back.
The Economist journalist Tim Jida talking there to Evan Davis. Well, the growing evidence of alleged war crimes emerging from areas which Russian troops have now withdrawn from appears to be galvanising the West's diplomatic response to the crisis. Britain and the United States both announced more sanctions on Wednesday, with the EU expected to confirm its own new measures in the coming days. A meeting of NATO members is also discussing whether to provide more military equipment to Ukraine ahead of an anticipated major offensive in the east of the country. More from our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams.
Call it the Bucha effect. Western governments appalled by scenes of apparent war crimes galvanised into fresh action to support Ukraine with weapons and punish Russia with sanctions. Boris Johnson, dispensing with the British government's usual caution when it comes to using the term genocide, spoke for many of his colleagues.
You look at what's happening in Bucha with the revelations that we're seeing from what Putin has done in Ukraine, which doesn't look far short of genocide. To me, it is no wonder that people are responding in the way that they are.
NATO foreign ministers are discussing how best to help Ukraine fight the battles that lie ahead. With Western officials saying the threat to the capital, Kiev, is now limited, all eyes are on the east, where a major Russian offensive is expected within weeks. Washington has announced a huge new shipment of anti-tank missiles. The Czech Republic has revealed it's supplying tanks. The urgent aim now to make sure that when the Russian offensive comes, Ukraine has what it needs to resist it. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said strengthening Ukraine was vital.
We have seen no indication that President Putin has changed his ambition to control the whole of Ukraine and also to rewrite the international order. So we need to be prepared for a long haul. We need to support Ukraine, sustain our sanctions, and strengthen our defenses and our deterrence.
Meanwhile, the US, UK and EU are all imposing fresh sanctions, the fifth wave so far. Washington has targeted Vladimir Putin's two grown-up daughters and his foreign minister Sergei Lavrov's wife and children. The US and Britain have both announced new measures against Russian banks, with Moscow's largest private, Alfa Bank, and its largest financial institution, Sberbank, both targeted. The UK government has also committed to ending all Russian coal and oil imports by the end of the year, while the latest European package is also supposed to include a ban on the import of Russian coal. But with Germany asking if it'll apply to existing contracts, approval of the measures, which also include a ban on Russian shipping, has been held up.
President Putin has lost a vocal cheerleader in the Russian parliament for his invasion of Ukraine, the veteran far-right politician Vladimir Jaranovsky, who's died in hospital after contracting coronavirus. The founder of Russia's first official opposition party in the early 1990s, he nonetheless carefully towed the Kremlin line. Here he is 3 years ago telling the BBC's Russia editor Steve Rosenberg how Moscow viewed its neighbour Ukraine.
It's our earth, it's our people, and you must forget Ukraine.
But Ukraine is independent.
Only Russia, not independence, no independence. It's our territory.
Vladimir Jaranovsky believed in an expanded Russian empire, which he once wrote should reach the shores of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and stretch from Kabul to Istanbul. Steve Rosenberg has been reflecting on the politician's colourful career with Julian Marshall.
A very flamboyant figure, very controversial figure, who has been espousing ultra-nationalist views for 30 years. I mean, he appeared on the Soviet political scene. At the end of the Soviet Union, the Liberal Democrats were the first party to be allowed to form after the Communist Party ended its monopoly on power. And up popped Vladimir Jaranovsky. No one had seen him before. And there was a lot of talk at the time that the KGB had actually created his party. He denied that for many years. But he managed to survive for more than 30 years on the Soviet and then the Russian political scene.
But he had some outrageous views.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he loved expressing them. For example, he threatened to fire nuclear weapons against the West. He talked about carpet bombing the Baltic states and Poland. He suggested seizing Alaska. He loved to spark controversy. And one of the things I find particularly fascinating about Vladimir Jaranovsky is, many people dismissed his views at the time as the rantings and ravings of someone on the fringes of Russian politics. Millions of people did vote for him, but, he never threatened to take power in Russia. And yet, fast forward to today, and you see that actually a lot of his ideas, a lot of his views have actually become the mainstream in Russia. Because as Vladimir Putin's Russia has become increasingly anti-Western, increasingly aggressive, you can see in the views being expressed by Vladimir Putin, you can see the strain of Jaranovsky in them.
And those outrageous views, as I understand it, also included anti-Semitism, despite Mr. Jaranovsky's own Jewish heritage.
Yes, I mean, he did express anti-Semitic views, perhaps less so in recent years. I mean, I've met him on several occasions. He knew I was Jewish. We had some interesting conversations, interesting encounters even. I think he was someone who really liked to shock, someone who liked to surprise you with some of his views.
But on the dark side, Steve, Mr. Jaranovsky seemed to foretell what Russia is doing today in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. Very often, when Vladimir Jaranovsky said something, you could conclude that this is what the Kremlin was thinking. And many people used to say that. What Jaranovsky says, the Kremlin thinks. And I think it was at the end of last year that Mr. Jaranovsky got up in Parliament and suggested that this year, 2022, would not be a peaceful year. And he even came out with a date, I think, February the 22nd, he said, which actually turned out to be the date that Vladimir Putin recognised the independence of the self-proclaimed People's Republics in eastern Ukraine, the separatist states. And 2 days later, of course, Putin ordered Russian troops across the border into Ukraine for the start of what he called his special military operation.
The BBC's Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg. Still to come, is this the office of the future? We examine the enviable lifestyle of the digital nomad. In 1987, Thomas Sankara, a Marxist revolutionary and Burkina Faso's incumbent president, was gunned down in a coup d'etat. Now his successor, former President Blaise Compaoré, has been given a life sentence for complicity in that killing. Mr. Sankara's widow spoke following the announcement of the verdict.
We've been waiting for 35 years. We waited together, and today a verdict has come. The judge announced his verdict. It's the law, and we all appreciate it. This is something we've asked for. We've asked for justice and for the truth. We can say that we've learned a lot and confirmed things that were said. We now have a verdict, and we think the judge did what he was supposed to do.
The BBC's Lala Sai was watching developments from Ivory Coast.
A verdict was expected after 6 months of trial, a trial that happened more than 35 years after Sankara's death. There was a life sentence for former President Blaise Compaoré, who benefited from the coup which had Thomas Sankara killed, and the verdict was welcomed with a lot of applause in the courtroom.
But of course, Blaise Compaoré, he wasn't there, was he?
He was tried in absentia since he's now in exile in Côte d'Ivoire. And he's an Ivorian citizen now because his wife is Ivorian also. He's been living in the country since 2014. We've reached out to the authorities here who said they don't make any comment on judicial decisions. And when they had commented the decision during the earlier developments of this trial, they had said there was no question of extraditing an Ivorian citizen to Burkina Faso, and that anyways it was a Burkinabe internal affair matter.
But others were tried with him, weren't they?
They were, and 2 others had the same sentence, life sentence. Others had sentences ranging from 3 years to 20 years. There were 3 people who were acquitted.
Why was Thomas Sankara so important?
He was a very young, charismatic leader. Some saw him as a Pan-Africanist, but also a left-winger who stood up before the former colonial power of France. He used to be an icon at the time because he used to promote values such as self-pride, self-sufficiency, and not accepting imperialism. And these are values that the youth in French-speaking West Africa and beyond also still believe in.
He was shot dead back in 1987. So why has this trial taken so long to take place?
Because former President Blaise Compaoré stayed in power for 27 years. And during that time, the murder of Thomas Sankara was considered a taboo subject. His family was almost banned from the country. One of his brothers was in exile. His wife also went to live in France. Another brother of his couldn't even complete his education. People in the country didn't want to have anything to do with the Sankaras. So after the popular uprising in 2014, people wanted answers around this death, and a new leadership came up and they allowed justice to be done.
A former security chief in Hong Kong who oversaw the police response to widespread pro-democracy protests has announced his candidacy to become the territory's leader. John Lee said he was available if the communist government in Beijing approved. The current chief executive, Carrie Lam, announced her retirement earlier this week. Here's our China correspondent, Stephen McDonnell.
For pro-democracy activists, it doesn't really matter who'll be chosen as Hong Kong's leader, because only candidates approved by the Communist Party will be allowed when a committee stacked with Beijing loyalists selects a new chief executive next month. However, today, according to Hong Kong media, the central government's representative office has said there's only one person who has its backing, John Lee. The former security chief is seen as a hardened foot soldier of the party, who's been sanctioned by Washington for his role in crushing all political opposition in the city. He gave a brief statement to the media. He said he was seeking the approval of the central government for his resignation as Hong Kong's number 2 leader in order to be considered for the top job. If Beijing clears the move, he said, he'd provide more details later. He then left the room without taking questions. John Lee was a Hong Kong police officer for 35 years. Later, as security chief, he oversaw the response to the protests of 2019 and ushered in the state security law, which has criminalised all forms of anti-government dissent. After individual sanctions were placed on him by the US government, he said, "I don't care. I scoff at that. I despise them."
Misinformation is big news. Now, the image-sharing social media network Pinterest says it will block false and misleading claims about the climate crisis. It's the latest move by the pinboarding platform to tackle the problem and is in contrast to the view of Facebook's founder Mark Zuckerberg, who argued it isn't the job of technology companies to be arbiters of the truth. So, how will Pinterest weed out falsehoods? Melon Thomas is our climate disinformation reporter.
They've explained to us that it's going to be done with human moderators and its own systems, but it's actually pretty tricky because people online tend to develop workarounds on how to get around the system. So this is something that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all have, but in terms of how effective and how well this will actually work, we'll have to wait and see.
Give us an example of what they would term as climate misinformation.
They've been really, really specific about their definition for climate misinformation. So anything around inaccurate posts about natural disasters, weather events, especially with cherry-picking scientific data. So this is something we've seen in terms of anti-vax content, and this is something we see commonly with climate change, where people will pick out outlandish numbers from an obscure scientific research paper to back up their own worldviews. So, for example, they'll say, back in the day, this many scientists already said that climate change wasn't real. But actually right now we know that almost all, so that's about 99.9% of all scientists agree that man-made climate change is real.
So if I go on Pinterest, what difference would it make to me as a user?
So you might think of it as a modern pinboard. So you might not consider it to be something that's used to spread misinformation. But for example, before speaking to you, I just had a look on the website. I typed in climate change as a hoax to see what comes up. And right now, it doesn't actually work. So the system itself hasn't actually implemented what it said, but it's done it before with anti-vaccination content. So if you type in vaccines on other social media websites, you might see vaccines are fake or vaccines kill. But actually, if you type in vaccines on Pinterest, instead, you'll go to a page where it shows you information from the World Health Organization instead. They haven't said this, but you might imagine that maybe they will link you to something from the UN's climate panel instead.
It's making Pinterest, isn't it, a leader in its field? What everyone will want to know is, will other social media sites follow?
Well, that is the real question, because Pinterest have been seen as a kind of small social media giant when it comes to this realm of things. So it has around 400 million users worldwide. Other social media giants have this kind of thing in place, but they've just not been so specific about it. So with Pinterest doing this now, it does call into question how Facebook and YouTube will react.
And now relax and listen to this. The sound of waves lapping onto a beach in the Italian seaside resort of Emilia-Romagna. It's just one of Italy's many popular tourist destinations which have been badly affected by the pandemic. That's why, in a bid to attract visitors back, the country has been rebranding itself as a haven for digital nomads, people who have employment that allows them to work from home. Mario Mirabile is from an organisation called South Working, which promotes remote working in the south of Italy. And he explained its appeal to Faria Massoud.
We have more than 200 places in Italy, so they are co-working, they are libraries. We have even cultural institutions such as museums adapting their spaces to co-working spaces. So very multifunctional places to host people, from remote workers to local communities.
What kind of things do you think would attract somebody like a digital nomad? Do you think it's the sun and the water of Italy and the greenery that's attracting people?
This could be attractive, but the main goal of South Working as an organization in terms of values is basically to take advantage of the commitment with local communities and the possibility to spend your time in traditional marginalized areas, but obviously with the advantage of living a real situation, a real context, not like gentrified places all over the world.
Italy has been attempting to revive its smaller towns and villages because many industries have disappeared. This particular scheme, Do you think it's the right way to maybe reverse the economic decline of some of those post-industrial regions?
I think yes. We estimated that 100,000 South workers employed in medium and big firms located in central and northern regions of Italy moved to the southern regions during the first lockdown. This could be the right place to work for them and give something back to the local communities. And actually today these numbers are increasing. So I think that the project can improve really the economies, inverting this decline in the economy in southern Italy and southern Europe. First of all, through the injection of liquidity, made possible by increasing the number of people who live and work voluntarily from the south and marginalized areas. But second, enhancement of human capital and social innovation translate into greater co-organized demand and advocacy for goods and public and private services, as well as for greater consumption, a positive impact on the GDP of the local context, and reducing social, economic, and territorial gaps. And third, I would underline this point, at the same time, the impact of these movements, these migration flows, is measured to avoid or mitigate any negative effects on local communities.
Mario Mirabile. And finally, to one of those developments that may scare or excite you. Engineers at Bristol University in southern England have developed an artificial fingertip that enables robots to have near human-like touch. They hope it can pave the way for machines to carry out more delicate tasks and to improve the dexterity of prosthetic hands. Nathan Lepora led the research and spoke to Audrey Brown.
Our hands are completely central to what makes us human. And the sense of touch is completely critical for our hands to work. In order to pick something up, you need to be able to feel its shape, to hold it securely, or in order to handle a tool, to say use a screwdriver, you need to be able to feel the screwdriver as you try to turn it. So you need that sensory feedback, that tactile feedback from your fingertips just to do the most common tasks. If you want to have a robot that can do jobs that we do as humans, from, say, helping us at home, clearing up rubbish, maybe sorting out our recycling or putting dishes in the dishwasher. If you want robots to be able to help us do those, then they need to be able to have a physical dexterity that we have as humans.
Now, I'm possibly one of the laziest people on earth, but I really actually don't want robots to do things that I feel that humans should do. So is that where it's going to be applied?
Yes, I think there's an ongoing progression of automatization in manufacturing and industry, which is happening anyway. Probably the first applications which are beginning to happen now are, say, in the logistics industry, packaging, sending parcels by post. A lot of that is still done by hand, but then I would see it as spreading from that into other physical tasks.
Was it difficult to get robots to have this sense of touch that we have as humans?
Our sense of touch is an extremely sophisticated sense. It's very high resolution. You can feel the tiniest detail. It's exquisitely sensitive as well. That is a really difficult engineering challenge to replicate that in a structure that's as small as a human fingertip. So we use multi-material 3D printing, which can print both soft and hard components at the same time as one piece. Our trick is we copy the physical structure of human skin. There's a tough, flexible outer layer called the epidermis over a softer inner layer called the dermis. And between those two layers are these structures called dermal papillae, which kind of protrude like little levers from the outside of the skin into the inside of the skin. They help give us our sense of touch mechanically. We copy that structure in our 3D printed fingertip, and then instead of using nerves and neurons in the real skin, what we do is we use a tiny little camera that's embedded within inside the fingertip, and that can image the movement of these dermal papillae, in that sense replicate the sense of touch that we have in humans.
Robotics professor Nathan Lepora. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be a new edition of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. This edition was mixed by Daffith Evans and produced by Nikki Verico. The editor, as always, is Karen Martin. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, bye-bye.